Hi guys, welcome back to Core HTML Mastery. We're going to continue looking at HTML forms. Now the question we left ourselves with is what happens if we click on this sign up or submit input element. So let's fill out some data. Let's put a name. Let's specify an email. Let's specify a password. Full disclosure, I'm just going to type password, which is something you should never do. And let's click sign up. And it's prompting us to save our login details. So that's a browser feature that is not directly related to HTML. We won't save that for now. And let's take a quick look at the address. Now, of course, it's actually pointing to a location on our hard drive rather than a website. Let's focus on what happens after the question mark. And in HTML, this is called a URL. So it contains the information of where the HTML document is located. Anything after a question mark on a URL is referred to as a query string. And take a look at this query string and see if the information looks familiar. Name equals Adam. Email equals Zenshal. We see that at has been replaced by a %40. So that's referred to as URL encoding. It's making sure the information we submit is safe. So it will remove certain special characters like the @ symbol, for example, zenshal@gmail.com. We then have this and or ampersand separator, and we have and password1 equals password, which is what I typed in, password2 equals password, and submit equals sign plus up. In other words, all of the information from our form has been submitted to the page that we're on. So it's reloaded the page, but it's submitted all of this form data to the page. Now, the way forms normally work is we don't actually submit form data to the same page that the form is on. So when the user submits form data, it usually gets sent to another page on our website. And very often it might be some kind of backend page that's not to be accessed directly via our browser. It might be something running on the server. It might be a PHP script, for example, or it might be a node.js script running on the back end. And the information is sent there, and the server then processes this form input. Now we can see by default, it just sends that form data to the same page that we're currently on, but we can actually control where that form data is sent. And we do that by specifying attributes on our form element. So action, this is going to be where we actually send the form request. Now, just as a quick recap of our structure, as an experiment, we could send this form data to page2.html. But in most cases, you wouldn't send form data to a HTML page because it doesn't have the power to process that form data. You would send it to something like a PHP file, for example. But for now, let's just set action. And we know we're in the main directory. So we're going to go to pages page2.html. We could just pretend that this page2 has the power to process our form input. And we can also specify a method. Now this can get a little bit advanced and is outside the scope of what we're doing here with the course on basic HTML. But let's just say there are different ways of sending requests to a web page. And the most common is something that's referred to as a GET request, but there are different types of requests, and these are referred to as HTTP requests. So there's GET request, there's other types of requests such as POST request, delete request. We don't need to go through those right now. For now, we're just going to set method equals GET. And what we're saying here is submit the value of this form, so all of the input values from the user, to page2.html and use a GET HTTP request. That's all you need to know for now. So if we save this, let's refresh our page. We'll input our data again. Shouldn't take too long. And let's click the sign up button. Guess what? We get taken to page 2. And if you have a look at the URL bar, all of that form data has been sent as part of the query string. And assuming this particular page had some PHP on it, for example, it could then process that form input. It could actually create an account for the user on the back end. So key takeaways here, don't worry too much about the technicalities of how you would create a user. That's something that we'll discuss in a later course. The main takeaway here is that the form element takes an action attribute, which tells us where that data is going to be submitted, and it takes a method attribute which tells us how that data is going to be sent. And we're just using a get method so we can access the result in our browser. A lot of the time, forms will have method of type post. So just keep that in mind. Now, there's a term that we use that's connected with generating forms, and that term is verification. And what we can do is verify that the data the user has input into the form makes sense before we submit that form. Now, in a lot of cases, you'll use a slightly more advanced language like JavaScript for form verification, but HTML actually has some built-in features for form verification. So a simple example is we can specify a required attribute. And just a heads up on attributes. In a lot of cases, an attribute has a value. For example, we had placeholder, which is the attribute, and then name, which is the attribute value. But required doesn't need a value. This attribute is either present or it's not present. So there are a few attributes like this. Required is one of those attributes that doesn't need a value. Now let's specify required for that input type of name. Let's refill out our form and we'll just type anything for password. Let's click sign up and let's see if we get migrated to page 2 in our app. We don't move anywhere because that form data is not submitted. Why not? Because we have the required attribute on the name input. So you can see we get this message, please fill in this field. So we've done this purely with HTML attribute required. Now let's say we do specify a name, but for the email, we type something that's clearly not an email, right? How do we know that's not an email address? Because it doesn't have an @ character in, right? And that's also built in. This is why it's good to use input type equals email rather than input type equals text, for example. So let's say our user tries to use a fake email to create an account on our site. They click sign up. It says, please enter an email address. Now, of course, they could just make up a fake email with the @ and they could bypass this specific verification. But let's just say our user types something that's blatantly not an email address, or they mistype their email and forget the @. We get this verification here, please enter an email address. And it's not going to let us submit that form until we pass this HTML verification. So there's really no drawback to adding the required attribute to any of these input elements where we want that data to be required. Now, of course, if it's optional data and you don't mind whether the user submits that specific piece of data, then feel free to not include required. That wouldn't make sense, right? Because the user, we're telling them it's optional to input that data. For example, we have on this form something like favorite color. Unclear why we're asking that as part of a sign-up form or registration form, so we could make it optional to the user. So there's no point then having the required attribute on that because it's forcing them to name their favorite color when we don't really need that as part of the sign-up process. With this form, typically everything will be required as part of the sign-up process. So we'll definitely need a password, we'll definitely need a name and an email, so we can just specify required for everything here. So if our user doesn't retype the password verification and tries to sign up, well, first of all, this is not a valid email. Let's add an @. So you can see it's fairly smart. It knows that you can't just add an @ at the beginning or the end of the string. It knows we need text after the @, but we've actually bypassed that verification now. Keep in mind, this is really a feature to help the user. It's not a security feature as such. Our security should actually happen on the back end after the form gets submitted, because as you can see, it's fairly easy to fool this verification. We refer to this as front-end verification. So this is really mostly to help the user. There are ways to bypass this. So just keep that in mind as a side concept. Anytime we are accepting input from a user, there are security implications involved. We have to be very careful what we accept from the user and what we do with that information after we accept it. So back to our form, we've typed in everything, we just didn't retype our password. And as you can see, we can't actually make progress here because this is a required HTML field. Now you might be wondering, how exactly do we get HTML to check whether the password 1 matches with password 2? And the answer is we won't use HTML for that. We'll generally use something like JavaScript. So keep in mind, the more advanced forms of verification usually rely on JavaScript. But sometimes it's easy to forget that we have 1 or 2 really easy, straightforward verification tools, which are actually built into HTML. So another example of a built-in verification feature is for the name. we could actually specify a max length attribute. So let's set max length equals, and you'll have to choose something reasonable here because sometimes users have fairly long names, legitimate names. But for now, let's just set an arbitrarily low value. Let's set max length equals 5. And you can see the name I have in the input field right now is clearly longer than 5 characters. So if we click sign up, well, we need to refresh the page first, in fact, to see our changes in place. Let's click sign up. Please shorten this text to 5 characters or less. You're currently using 10 characters. So you can see we have some very, very simple to use built-in HTML verification on these input fields. So one application to this might be specifying a min length on the password field, right? Because we want to make sure that our user's password is fairly secure. So let's change this to min length. And let's say, for example, we want to enforce that the user's password is at least 8 characters. So if I type here, for example, a 5-character password and we click sign up, well, first of all, we need to refresh the page. So let's type a really short password here, sign up. Now it says, please use at least 8 characters. You are currently using 4 characters. So we can enforce a certain level of password security without using any JavaScript and purely just using HTML verification. But as mentioned, for the more advanced stuff, we will make use of JavaScript for front-end form verification in a lot of cases. Well, that's pretty much all you need to know for getting started with forms in HTML. Thanks very much for watching, guys, and I'll catch you in the next part of the course.